The dust tastes of failure. It coats her tongue, grinds between her teeth, and settles in a fine, gritty layer over the cracked leather of her worn-out shoes. She stands before a gate grander than any church entrance she has ever seen, its heavy timber crossbeams spelling out a single, imposing word: Blackwood. Beyond it, a sprawling ranch house sits anchored to the earth, a fortress of wealth and solitude against the vast, indifferent Wyoming sky. Her knuckles are raw from knocking on other, less promising doors. Her stomach is a hollow, aching cavern. This is the last chance before the wilderness claims her. She begs for crumbs and a nook to rest. A simple plea from a woman who has nothing left to offer but the strength of her own two hands. From the shaded porch, a man emerges. He is tall and broad, carved from the same hard country as the mountains at his back. His face is a mask of stern grief, his eyes holding a chill that has nothing to do with the coming autumn. He listens to her desperate, whispered request for work, any work, with an unnerving stillness. His silence is a wall, and her hope begins to crumble against it. He is about to speak, to deliver the final rejection that will send her away, when a small shape appears at his side. A boy, no older than 5 or 6, with his father's dark hair and a profound, lonely silence in his eyes, peeks around a denim-clad leg. The boy's gaze fixes on her, not with pity or curiosity, but with a startling, solemn recognition. The rancher's mouth opens to say no, but the child, his voice a rusty hinge and used for too long, points a small, determined finger and says a single, world-altering word: her. There's more to this character than meets the eye. Before their true worth or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The man, Silas Blackwood, stared at the woman, his expression unchanged. The dust had settled on her patched dress and clung to the exhausted lines around her eyes. He had built this ranch, this empire of cattle and land, on a foundation of shrewd decisions and the brutal exclusion of anything that might prove a weakness. A drifter, a woman with nothing but a story of hardship he'd heard 100 times before, was the very definition of a weakness. His wife, Sarah, had been the soft heart of this place. Since her passing a year ago, the house had become as hard and quiet as he was. His son, Leo, had barely spoken in that year. He'd retreated into a world of silence that no doctor from Cheyenne could penetrate. Now, that silence was broken by a single, commanding word. Leo did not release his father's leg, but his gaze remained locked on the woman, Elara. Silas's first instinct, the one that had served him well in business and in life, was to ignore the boy's strange impulse. He needed to protect his son, and that meant keeping the world at bay. But the look in Leo's eyes wasn't just interest. It was a flicker of life, a spark in the gray ash of their shared grief. He weighed the risk of this stranger against the impossible-to-ignore hope of that spark. "I need a cook and a laundress," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to stir the dust at their feet. The words felt foreign, unplanned. The last one couldn't stand the quiet. He didn't mention that he had driven her away with his own thunderous silence. "The bunkhouse is for the men. There's a storage room off the kitchen. It has a cot. You can have that. You'll get meals and $1 a week. You start now. The boy needs supper." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned, and after a moment's hesitation, Leo released his leg and followed. Silas didn't look back to see if the woman was coming, but he heard the soft, shuffling sound of her worn-out shoes on the gravel path behind him. It was the sound of a ghost being given a reason to walk among the living again. Elara followed him into a house that was more like a cathedral of sorrow than a home. Polished wood gleamed in the dim light, and fine furniture sat shrouded in a thin veil of disuse. The air was still and cold, heavy with unspoken loss. It was a wealthy man's house, but it was not a home. Silas led her through to a vast kitchen, dominated by a huge cast-iron stove that stood cold and black. He gestured vaguely toward a pantry. "There's salt pork, beans, flour, coffee." Then he pointed to a narrow door. "That's your room." He left her there without another word, Leo trailing in his wake like a small shadow. Elara opened the door and found a space no bigger than a closet. It was clean but stark, containing only a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single, folded blanket. A small, high window let in a sliver of the dying afternoon light. To her, after weeks of sleeping in barns and ditches, it looked like a palace. She placed her small, pathetic bundle of belongings at the foot of the cot and took a deep, shuddering breath. The air smelled of soap and dust and old wood. It smelled of safety. Forcing the exhaustion from her bones, she turned back to the kitchen. Her hands, though trembling, knew their work. She found the kindling box, laid a fire in the stove with an efficiency born of long practice, and coaxed it to life. The first flicker of warmth in that cold hearth felt like a victory. As she searched the pantry, she found not just the staples Silas had mentioned, but forgotten sacks of potatoes and onions in a root cellar, a few jars of preserved peaches, and even a small tin of cinnamon. Luxuries. She worked silently, her movements economical and sure. She made a simple stew of salt pork and potatoes, the aroma slowly, tentatively, filling the cavernous kitchen. She mixed a batch of biscuits, her hands remembering the motions her mother had taught her so long ago. As she worked, she felt the presence of the boy. Leo stood in the doorway, watching her with those old, solemn eyes. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave. He just watched, a silent sentinel guarding the border between his world of silence and the one she was trying to enter. When the stew was simmering and the biscuits were browning, Alara wiped her hands on the rough apron she'd found hanging on a hook. She looked at the boy. On impulse, she knelt down so they were at eye level. "I'm Alara," she said softly. The boy just stared. His silence was not shy. It was profound, a deliberate choice. He seemed to be weighing her, judging her. Then, he turned and walked away. Alara's heart sank. She had failed some unspoken test. She rose, her knees aching, and turned back to the stove, blinking back the sudden, sharp sting of tears. She was a fool to think a child's whim could save her. She was here on a thread, and that thread could be cut at any moment. Dinner was a silent affair. Silas sat at the head of a long, polished dining table built for a dozen people. Leo sat to his right, and a place had been set for Alara at the far end, a chasm of empty chairs between them. She had brought the food in, setting the tureen of stew and the plate of biscuits on the table, and had been about to retreat to the kitchen when Silas gestured curtly to the empty chair. "You work here. You eat here." It wasn't an invitation, it was a command. She sat, feeling small and out of place. The stew, which had smelled so hearty and welcoming in the kitchen, tasted like ash in her mouth. Silas ate with a grim focus, his attention on his plate. But Alara noticed he took a second helping of the biscuits. Leo, for his part, did something extraordinary. He picked up his fork and ate. He ate every last bite in his bowl, sopping up the gravy with a piece of biscuit, just as a normal 5-year-old boy would. When he was finished, he looked down the long table at Alara. For the first time, a flicker of something other than sorrow crossed his face. It was a quiet, fleeting look of contentment. Silas saw it too. He put his fork down, his knuckles white. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. He looked from his son to the woman at the far end of his table, a ghost in a patched dress who had somehow, with a simple meal, achieved what he had not been able to in a year. She had reached his son. The realization did not bring him comfort. It settled in his gut like a cold, heavy stone of resentment. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by work and silence. Alara rose before the sun, lighting the stove, putting on coffee, and starting breakfast. She cleaned the main house with a quiet thoroughness, erasing the film of neglect that had settled since Sarah's death. She washed their clothes, hanging them on a line out back where they snapped in the ceaseless Wyoming wind. She tended a small, struggling kitchen garden she'd discovered behind the house, coaxing life back into the parched soil. She worked from dawn until long after dusk, earning her keep, making herself indispensable in the hopes of becoming invisible, a part of the house's machinery that functioned too well to be discarded. Silas rarely spoke to her. He would issue orders in the morning. "The men need provisions at the North Camp," or "mend this shirt," and she would comply without a word. He watched her from a distance, his expression unreadable. He saw the efficiency of her work, the way she never wasted a motion or a crumb of food. He saw the deep, weary caution in her eyes. He had hired her for his son, but he found her presence to be a quiet, constant disturbance to the careful order of his grief. The house was warmer. It smelled of baking bread instead of old memories. It was slowly, unnervingly, starting to feel like a home again, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that. Leo remained her shadow. He followed her from the kitchen to the laundry shed, from the garden to the chicken coop. He still rarely spoke, but his silence was different now. It was a companionable silence. He would hand her clothespins or sit on the porch steps, meticulously lining up stones while she swept. One afternoon, while she was kneading dough, he tugged on her apron. He held up a small, wooden horse, its leg broken. He didn't say a word, just looked at her with pleading eyes. Alara wiped her flour-dusted hands and took the toy. She found a small bottle of wood glue in a dusty toolbox and, with delicate, patient fingers, she set the leg. She wrapped it tightly with a bit of twine to hold it while it dried. "There," she whispered, setting it carefully on the windowsill. "He needs to rest, just for a little while. Then he'll be as good as new." Leo watched her, his lower lip trembling slightly. Then he did something that made Alara's breath catch in her throat. He leaned forward and rested his head against her side for just a moment, a silent, profound gesture of trust. She froze, every instinct screaming at her not to move, not to breathe, not to scare away this fragile creature. She slowly, tentatively, rested her hand on his dark, soft hair. From the doorway of his study, Silas watched the entire exchange. He saw the broken toy, the woman's gentle hands, his son's small gesture of affection. He saw the look on Alara's face, a mixture of surprise, tenderness, and a deep, aching sorrow, as if she were remembering a kindness she thought she had lost forever. He felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest, a complicated knot of jealousy, gratitude, and something else he refused to name. He turned and walked away before they could see him, the floorboards creaking under the weight of his confusion. The first frost came, painting the prairie in silver and signaling the need for a trip to town for winter supplies. Silas had always taken these trips alone, finding a grim solace in the anonymity of his errands. This time, he found himself saying, "We're going to town. The boy needs a winter coat. You should come. See what you need for the kitchen." The words were practical, an order, but they felt like more. Alara simply nodded, her expression revealing nothing. The wagon ride to Clayton was tense. Silas drove, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Alara sat beside him, her hands folded primly in her lap, while Leo sat between them, a small, warm presence. He was vibrating with a quiet excitement, a stark contrast to the stony adults on either side of him. Clayton was a town that thrived on gossip as much as it did on cattle trade. The moment Silas Blackwood's wagon pulled up in front of the general store with a strange woman beside him, the curtains in every window twitched. Silas was a pillar of the community, his wealth and his tragedy making him a figure of intense speculation. His self-imposed isolation had only fueled the town's curiosity. Inside the store, the air grew thick with unspoken questions. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, greeted Silas with his usual deferential respect, but his eyes kept flicking to Alara. She kept her own gaze lowered, acutely aware of the whispers that rustled in the corners like dry leaves. She focused on her list, pointing out bags of flour, sugar, and beans for Silas to load. It was when she was looking at bolts of wool, trying to decide on the most durable and inexpensive cloth for new curtains, that Henderson's wife approached. Mrs. Henderson was a woman whose piety was matched only by her sharp tongue. "Finding everything you need, dear?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She didn't look at Alara. She looked past her, at Silas, who was testing the weight of a new axe handle. It must be so difficult for Mr. Blackwood, raising that poor boy all alone. A man needs a proper woman to run his house. A woman of good standing. The implication was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She was a drifter, a nobody. She had no standing. She was nothing more than a hired girl, a convenience. She expected Silas to ignore the comment, to pretend he hadn't heard. That's what men like him did. They didn't involve themselves in women's gossip. But Silas didn't ignore it. He set the axe handle down on the counter with a heavy thud that made both women jump. He turned, his eyes like chips of granite. "Alara is a harder worker than any two women in this town," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And my household is my concern, not yours." He looked at Alara. "Are you finished?" She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He paid for the goods, his movements clipped and angry, and loaded the wagon in silence. The ride home was even quieter than the ride in, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the reverberations of his defense, a shield he had unexpectedly raised for her. She stole a glance at his profile, at the hard line of his jaw, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sun. She had come to his ranch begging for a nook to rest, and he had just, in front of the whole town, built her a fortress. The harsh Wyoming winter descended upon the Blackwood Ranch not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with the fury of a blizzard that seemed intent on wiping the world clean. For 3 days, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and snow piled in great, white drifts that buried fences and isolated the ranch from the rest of the world. They were trapped, Silas, Alara, and Leo, an unlikely trinity in the vast, silent house. The enforced proximity changed the currents between them. There were no ranch hands to feed, no trips to town, no work to be done in the frozen fields. There was only the house, the fire, and each other. The silence, once a buffer, now became a space that demanded to be filled. It was Leo who filled it. Freed from the routine, he blossomed. He chattered to Alara as she baked, telling her long, rambling stories about his wooden horse and a friendly badger he imagined lived under the porch. He brought her books, pointing at the pictures, and she would make up tales to go with them, her voice soft and melodic in the warm kitchen. Silas found himself lingering by the kitchen doorway, a book open in his hands, but his attention fixed on the scene before him. He listened to the sound of her voice, a sound that had become as essential as the crackle of the fire in the hearth. He watched the way his son looked at her, with an open, unguarded adoration that he, the boy's own father, had not seen in over a year. The cold knot of resentment in his gut was slowly, painfully, beginning to melt away, replaced by a feeling so foreign and so potent it terrified him: hope. On the second night of the storm, the wind shrieked with a particular violence, rattling the window panes in their frames. A crash from upstairs was followed by a child's terrified scream. Both Alara and Silas were on their feet in an instant. They met at the bottom of the staircase, their eyes locking for a split second in shared panic before they raced up the stairs together. They found Leo sitting bolt upright in his bed, his face pale in the moonlight, his eyes wide with terror. A branch, heavy with ice, had cracked and fallen against his window. He was shaking, pointing at the window, and whispering the one word he had not uttered in a year: "Mama." Silas froze in the doorway, his heart seizing in his chest. He knew this nightmare. It was the one where Leo relived the fever, the final, frantic hours of Sarah's life. He had tried to comfort him through it before, but his own grief was a clumsy, heavy thing, and his attempts had only ever made the boy's terror worse. But Alara didn't hesitate. She went to the bed, sat on the edge, and gathered the trembling boy into her arms. She didn't shush him or offer empty platitudes. She just held him, rocking him gently, her hand stroking his hair. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of his fear. "It was just the wind, little one. Just the wind telling its stories. It's a lonely sound, but it can't hurt us in here. We're safe." She began to hum, a simple, nameless tune that was more of a feeling than a melody. It was the sound of comfort, of safety, of a love so pure and unconditional it seemed to weave itself into the very air of the room. Leo's trembling slowly subsided. His panicked breaths evened out. He burrowed his face into her shoulder, his small hands clutching her dress, and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Silas stood in the doorway, a silent witness to a miracle. He watched Alara gently lay his son back down, tucking the blankets around him with a tenderness that made his own throat ache. She smoothed the hair back from Leo's forehead, her fingers lingering for a moment. When she finally turned and saw Silas standing there, her face was a portrait of quiet empathy. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a shared understanding of the boy's pain. "He misses his mother," she said softly, as if it were the simplest, most obvious thing in the world. "Yes," Silas managed to say, his voice thick. They walked down the stairs together, the silence between them now humming with a new, fragile intimacy. In the main room, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Alara moved to bank them for the night, but Silas stopped her with a hand gently on her arm. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that shot through them both. "Stay," he said. It was not an order. It was a plea. He added another log to the fire, and they sat in the two large armchairs that flanked the hearth, the chairs he and Sarah had always occupied. For a long time, they just watched the flames. "Where did you come from, Elara?" he asked finally, his voice quiet. She looked into the fire, her profile etched in flickering gold. "A place I don't care to remember. A life that wasn't mine. My father, he promised me to a man to settle a debt. I ran. I've been running for a long time." Her confession was stark, unadorned with self-pity. She stated it as a fact, like the color of the sky or the hardness of the ground. Silas thought of the whispers in town, of Mrs. Henderson's cruel judgment. He had defended Alara's worth as a worker. He realized now he knew nothing of her true worth, of the strength it must have taken for her to survive, to run, to end up on his doorstep with her spirit bent but not broken. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, the words surprising him as much as they did her. She turned to look at him then, and in her eyes, he saw a universe of pain, but also a dawning, hesitant light. The storm raged on outside, but within the walls of the Blackwood Ranch house, something had broken open, clearing the air for the first time in a long, lonely year. The thaw came as suddenly as the storm. The world emerged, dripping and glistening, from its white cocoon. The road to town became passable again, and with it, the world intruded. A letter arrived, carried by a ranch hand who'd managed to get through. It bore a fine, elegant script and the seal of a prominent Cheyenne family. It was from Beatrice, Sarah's older sister. She was coming for a visit, she announced, to see how her poor nephew was faring. A knot of dread tightened in Silas's stomach. Beatrice had disapproved of him from the start, considering him a rough rancher unworthy of her sister's delicate sensibilities. Since Sarah's death, she had made it clear she believed Leo should be raised by her, in the civilized society of the city. Elara saw the change in him immediately. The fragile peace the storm had forged between them evaporated, replaced by his old, familiar tension. He retreated back into his study, the door closing on the warmth of the kitchen and the sound of Leo's laughter. Beatrice arrived a week later in a carriage that was far too fine for the muddy ranch roads. She was a tall, severe woman, dressed in immaculate black silk that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Her eyes, a pale, cold blue, swept over the house with a critical air. They landed on Elara, who was serving coffee, and dismissed her with a single, contemptuous glance. "Silas, darling," she said, her voice like the clink of ice in a glass. "You look tired. This place, it's so rustic. And who is this?" She gestured vaguely in Alara's direction. "This is Elara," Silas said, his tone clipped. "She helps with the house. And Leo." "I see," Beatrice said, her thin lips tightening. "A hired girl." The visit was an exercise in veiled hostility. Beatrice cooed over Leo, who responded by hiding behind Alara's skirts. She reminisced endlessly about Sarah, each memory a subtle jab at Silas's inability to preserve his wife's delicate tastes. She criticized the food, the curtains, the very air in the house, her disapproval a constant, suffocating presence. Her true target, however, was Elara. She watched her every move, her gaze sharp and malicious. She saw the easy affection between Elara and Leo, and she saw the quiet, unspoken understanding that now existed between Elara and Silas. And she saw it all as a threat. The confrontation came on the third day. Beatrice found Elara in the garden, humming as she weeded the new spring shoots. "You seem to have made yourself quite at home," Beatrice began, dispensing with any pretense of politeness. Elara stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "I work here, ma'am." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Beatrice sneered. "You're a clever one, I'll give you that. Drifting in here, preying on a grieving man and a motherless child. Do you really think he'll marry you? A little nobody with dirt under her fingernails." Alara's face paled, but she held her ground. "Your brother-in-law's intentions are his own. I am here to care for his son. You will be here for nothing," Beatrice hissed, taking a step closer. "I have spoken with my lawyer. Silas is clearly not capable of providing a suitable environment for a child of Sarah's breeding. The isolation, the lack of proper society, and now this arrangement with a vagrant. I am going to petition the court for custody of Leo. And when I win, the first thing I will do is see you thrown off this land with nothing, just as you came." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp as an icicle. It wasn't just about custody, it was about annihilation. Beatrice wanted to destroy the fragile world Alara had found, to cast her back out into the wilderness. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over Alara. But then she thought of Leo's hand in hers, of the sound of his laughter, of the look in Silas's eyes across the fire. And for the first time in her life, she found she had something worth fighting for. "You won't take him," Alara said, her voice low but steady. "This is his home." Beatrice laughed, a short, ugly sound. "This is a mud pit, and you are nothing. We'll see what the sheriff has to say." She turned on her heel and marched back toward the house, her black silk dress rustling with righteous fury. Alara stood frozen in the garden, the rich, dark earth beneath her feet suddenly feeling like quicksand. Beatrice was as good as her word. 2 days later, a buggy rattled up the drive, carrying not only the imperious woman but also Sheriff Miller, a man whose respect for the law was often swayed by the influence of wealth. Silas met them on the porch, his face set like stone. He had known this was coming. Alara stood just inside the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs, with Leo clinging nervously to her hand. "Silas," Beatrice said, her voice ringing with false sympathy as she ascended the steps. "I'm sorry it has come to this. Sheriff, I've explained the situation. My nephew is being raised in an unstable environment, under the influence of this person." She gestured dismissively toward Alara, not even deigning to look at her. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. He was a practical man caught between the county's most powerful rancher and a woman with powerful connections in the capital. "Silas, Mrs. Thorne has expressed some serious concerns about the boy's welfare." "My son's welfare is my only concern," Silas stated, his voice a low growl. He didn't take his eyes off Beatrice. "And he is well cared for. By a penniless drifter you picked up off the road?" Beatrice scoffed, her voice rising. "We know nothing about her. She could be a thief, a murderer. For all you know, she's after your money. You are making a fool of yourself and dishonoring my sister's memory by allowing this woman to touch her child." The venom in her words was potent. Alara flinched as if struck. She felt Leo tremble beside her and instinctively tightened her grip on his small hand. She wanted to run, to disappear, to take the boy with her and hide him from this ugliness. "That is enough, Beatrice," Silas warned, taking a step forward. "It is not enough," she shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "You will get rid of her. Now, you will send her away, or I will see you ruined, Silas. I will drag your name through every court in this territory. You will lose this ranch, and you will lose my sister's son. Make your choice." The air on the porch was electric. The world shrunk to this single, terrible moment. The sheriff shifted his weight, his hand resting on his gun belt, a man waiting for a verdict. Alara's fate, Leo's future, Silas's life, it all hung on his next words. He could placate Beatrice. It would be the easy path. Send the hired girl away, promise to find a more suitable governess, and make this all disappear. He looked at Beatrice, at her face contorted with hate and ambition. Then he looked past her, into the house, at Alara. Her face was pale with fear, but her chin was high, and her body was a shield in front of his son. It was in that moment of unbearable tension that Leo, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally let go of Alara's hand. He stepped out from behind her, planting his small feet firmly on the wooden planks of the porch. He looked not at his father, but directly at the terrifying woman in black who was threatening to tear his world apart. His voice, when it came, was not the rusty hinge of a year ago. It was clear, ringing with a 5-year-old's absolute, unwavering conviction. "No," he shouted, the word a thunderclap in the sudden silence. He pointed a small, furious finger at his aunt. "You go away. She's not a hired girl." He turned, ran the few steps to Alara, and wrapped his arms tightly around her legs, burying his face in her skirt. He looked up at the shocked faces of the adults, his own face fierce with love and defiance. "That's my mom." The world stopped. The wind died. The buzzing of a fly by the doorpost seemed deafeningly loud. Beatrice stared, her mouth agape, speechless for the first time in her life. Sheriff Miller's jaw went slack. Silas looked at his son, clinging to the woman he had almost turned away. He saw not a drifter and a boy, but a mother and her child. And in that instant, the last wall around his own heart crumbled to dust. The grief for what he had lost was finally, blessedly, overshadowed by the fierce, protective love for what he had found. He walked past Beatrice as if she weren't there and knelt, placing one hand on Leo's back and the other on Alara's arm. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a raw, powerful emotion she had never seen before. "He's right," he said, his voice thick but steady. Then he stood, turning to face the intruders on his land. He was no longer just a grieving widower. He was the master of Blackwood Ranch, a king in his own country, and his voice held the unshakable authority of that truth. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "Mrs. Thorne is trespassing. Kindly escort her from my property." He then fixed his gaze on Beatrice, and the cold fury in his eyes made her take an involuntary step back. "You will never threaten my family again. You will never speak Alara's name again. And you will never see Leo again. If you or any of your lawyers ever set foot on this land, I will consider it a hostile act. Is that understood?" Beatrice sputtered, her face a mask of disbelief and rage, but the fight had gone out of her. She had been defeated, not by Silas's wealth or power, but by the simple, undeniable truth spoken by a child. Sheriff Miller, seeing the unbreakable bond of the three people before him, tipped his hat. "My apologies for the intrusion, Silas," he mumbled, and gently but firmly took Beatrice's arm, leading her back toward the buggy. Silas, Alara, and Leo stood on the porch, watching as the buggy turned and rattled away, its dust trail a faint, fading scar on the horizon. The threat was gone. The air was still and clean. Leo, his duty done, still clung to Alara's leg, his small body relaxed now in the aftermath of his victory. Silas turned to Alara. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward or heavy with grief. It was a space of profound, breathless possibility. He reached out and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against her skin. "This is your home now, Alara," he said softly, his voice full of a meaning that went far beyond shelter and wages. "If you'll have it." Tears welled in her eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so overwhelming it stole her breath. She could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She looked down at the boy whose fierce love had saved them all, and then back up at the man whose quiet strength had become her fortress. He wasn't just a wealthy rancher, and she was no longer a woman begging for crumbs. They were, against all odds, a family. On the vast Wyoming prairie, under the endless, watchful sky, they had found their own quiet nook in the world, and it was more than enough. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.